Hi everyone, you know who it is. We are you know what I'm saying? From the red side of Alaska, and we are Theodore, Karlton, and Rena. We are going to talk about the two sides of Nixon presidency. One side of being liberal and the other side of conservative. This started in 1970s when the Nixon introduced many environmental reforms along with his leadership on environmental issues. Nixon took the nation in a new direction in the foreign affairs as a presidential candidate. Nixon promised to end the U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. Nixon developed a new approach to the Cold War. What did Nixon do, Theodore?
And changed the way the US approached to the world when he became president. Before Nixon took office, a lot of Americans later had the same Cold War belief. They split the world into us and them, and they fixed the policies that are focused on assumption commonly known as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Nixon and Henry Kissinger became close partners even though Nixon was a conservative California Republican. Kissinger had fought Nixon in several previous presidential races. Both were outsiders with an ability to challenge what was accepted. Nixon and Kissinger embraced the project of realpolitik. The two statesmen proclaimed that America should put aside their Cold War discriminatory and look at the world with new eyes. Rena, can you tell us about the relations with China?
One of Nixon's first moves was opening relations with China. Nixon seemed determined to leave his mark on the nation's international affairs, while Lyndon Johnson focused primarily on domestic affairs. Nixon was more of the man of the world, interested in global politics and shifting alliances. Johnson believed that his great society would harden his reputation as a great president. Nixon also thought his reorientation of America's foreign policy would cement his legacy in the annals of U.S. history. In April 1971, Nixon was invited to China, where he pushed his plans in public in China and agreed to visit China. In February 1972, the president made the trip and was a great success. It had an important step toward normalizing relations with China. The same year, American tourists started visiting, and American companies set up thriving trade with China. It was the highest point in Nixon's presidency when the United States and China fully established diplomatic relations, potentially serving the alliance between the Soviet Union and China. Karlton, what was the reason for the vice president to be a spokener?
Nixon also sponsored many programs that increased in size and role of federal government in which they had a return power and money to the state. The enforcement of drugs of DEA and administration administers the federal war against them. The Clean of Air Act, signed into law in 1970, gives the EPA the power to set air quality standards. Nixon signed legislations that increased the social security benefits of widows and widowers, and signed the largest expansion of Medicare of the program's history in 1972. In response to the United States' decision to restock the Israeli military and gain power in the post-war peace talks, Arab countries of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries established a blockade against the United States during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. During that time, Americans felt the torment of this prohibition as oil prices rose to 400% in a year. This lasted till the spring of 1974 and emerged from gas lines at the pumps that stretched for blocks. Nixon fought the bad times in a lot of ways. He ended Bretton Woods' system of financial management in which the other countries' currencies were fixed to the US dollars, which in return was fixed to a set amount of gold. After all that, Nixon tried to place a lot of conservative Southerners as judges in federal courts. Nixon and the vice president successfully cast themselves as spokeners, which Nixon won almost 61% of popular vote, nearly all the electoral votes. He became the first presidential candidate to sweep the entire South. Theodore, what happened before the 1972 election night?
In 1972, Richard Nixon stood before the cameras on election night. He didn't know his downfall was already starting. The break-in at the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate complex back in June 1972 received a little bit more attention at first. Soon as the investigators began to untangle the connection between the burglars and the White House, Watergate, as it became known, came to dominate the national news. This led to the Senate's investigation and televised hearing, where many people charged that the president with his top aides had broken apart. Back to cover up from this, he started to deny any wrongdoings. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein played a role in lifting the veil of secrecy from the Watergate scandal. They named the secret government information known as Deep Throat. Nixon proclaimed his innocence, saying, "I'm not a crook," which the public disagreed with. Back in the fall of 1973, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in the face of non-related corruption scandal. According to the policy by the 25th Amendment, which dealt with president succession, President Nixon presented Gerald Ford to become his new vice president. Rena, what else happened about Watergate?
Relationship among the three branches of government. The committee charged Nixon with obstructing justice in the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. All the representatives would vote in the favor of impeachment, with many Republicans that would convince him in a trial with the Senate. Before that could happen, Nixon resigned. Nixon became the first and only president to resign in the presidency. Nixon was investigated, which found out he committed other abuses of presidential power by using federal agencies to go after his enemies and suspected of leaking information unfavorable to the administration. Richard Nixon damaged the name of the presidency and upset the population's trust in government. Congress passed several laws to improve and restore the population confidence in government and to stop abuses of power in the future. It accepted a procedure for naming independent guidelines to investigate charges against the White Cap about what we just talked about.
What we just talked about, the Watergate scandal revealed that the country could endure a significant crisis and highlighted the effectiveness of the system of checks and balance. Both Congress and the Supreme Court effectively limited presidential power, including the president is above the law. Alright, my fellow listeners, thank you for tuning to our historical podcast. If you'd like to listen for more historical content, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Jack Badkey.